What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we are going to be going over Instant Block Part 2, and I've called that True Instant Block. Basically, using Guilty Gear's system as a reference, we are at the closest point that we can be. So in the previous episode of Instant Block, we went over manual blocking, and this is the other side. This is the automatic blocking, or basically the pressing back to block. And that is how Guilty Gear does it. So we're going to make sure everything still works using the same logs that we did in the previous episode. You don't have to watch the previous episode to make this work, but I'm only going to touch briefly on what we did. And so I would recommend that you do watch the previous episode because some of the things that are in place are going to work for both methods, and I'm not going to rewrite them for this episode. Now, in the previous episode, again, I did manual block. So if I attack my opponent and I start manually blocking, very close within that frame window that we have, I will go into an instant block, and you can see that that had actually happened down here in the log. Now let's try it with the other method. Let's try it with the backing away. So if I attack and I start backing away, that was an automatic block, but I performed the instant block still. If I am to spam the back button, you're going to see that we have entered the blocking state too often, too few frames, so the instant block is invalidated. So if I start mashing this button, same in the corner, and I get attacked, I cannot perform an instant block. The instant block is invalidated. And this is the same for the manual blocking as well. There is one other thing that I did not cover in the previous instant block episode that we are going to want for both systems, the manual and the pressing back, to perform it. Once the window runs out, once we can no longer instant block, we want to just completely invalidate the ability to instant block. So before, I could press the block button, hold it, and start spamming this button, and sometimes I would still perform an instant block because the character's frames ended up within the proper window because it looped back over. We have made sure that that is not possible anymore, and this works for backing away as well, so you don't have to worry about any of that. This is all fixed now. We have a perfect instant block system. Invalidates damage, pushback, and all that good stuff. Now we still don't have any visuals on the screen, like we don't make the character glow white or anything like that. I'm going to have one final episode with all that because I went a little over the top with it. I didn't want to include it in this episode. I wanted to include it in its own episode. Now, before we get started, if you want to get caught up in the series, feel free to check out this playlist right here in the top right corner. This will help you learn about all the episodes that we've done in this tutorial series, and you can get caught up. Make sure you match every single mechanic that we've made. This will allow you to make your own fighting game. Alternatively, if you don't care about that, but you care about the instant block, I would recommend watching this first episode. As I said, there is a lot of content that is very important in this first episode on the manual block that is going to be reused and repurposed for this automatic block or this other block method. Plus, in your game, you most likely don't have both block methods implemented, as you only need one. And so, you don't have to separate the logic like I do, making it even more useful to watch that first episode. I also just want to note, I have updated my logo. So my Shawnthebro logo is now different. It's still me, I'm still the same Shawnthebro, but I've changed my logo. So if you see that logo around, just know that that is the new logo that I will be using everywhere for everything. With all that said, we can go ahead and get started. This is a code and blueprint tutorial, but today we're just going to be working in the code again. So let's go into the C++, and specifically let's go to fightertemplate_character.h. First thing I want to do is make a function to start tracking the instant block logic. I'll explain what this really means in a few minutes. Let's go down to our functions and make one new function. That's all we need in the .h file today. So here we go. I went below my start and stop blocking functions, and I made a new function called start tracking instant block data. As the comment says, we start tracking data for instant blocks such as the initial frame the input was pressed. The reason that I'm making this function is so that we can match what we were doing and start manually blocking in the previous episode. Again, I'll go over that in a few minutes, but it's super important that we make it into a function because when we are using back inputs to block instead of one singular button, there are more inputs we have to track to make sure that we've pressed the appropriate buttons at the right time. Pressing back and pressing crouch back in this case can both perform an instant block, and again, if you have air blocking or jump blocking, that could also perform an instant block. But any back input should be made note of. So if you press any back input, so standing back and crouching back, for example, if the player is pressing those within that spammable window, we want to invalidate their instant block. They're still pressing the back button too frequently that we don't want them to be able to perform an instant block. So we need to track it for all cases, not just one button like we did in the previous episode. So this new function, start tracking instant block data, is going to have all the tracking data that we need, and we're going to call it whenever we run into a scenario where we pressed a back input. You'll notice this is not a U function, it's not blueprint callable. We don't need to call it in the blueprint. There's nothing we need to use it for in the blueprint. We just need to keep track of our data in the code. So it is just a regular C++ function. Now if we go into fighter template character, let's start manually blocking. Let's go to that function, because in here is where we were doing our logic last time. And basically we check to see if we are able to perform an instant block. And really the way we determine this is if we have not been invalidated for instant block due to spamming. So this num frames until instant block variable that we have, it is an integer that just tracks the number of frames until we can try to perform an instant block again. And if it is less than or equal to 0, that means we are able to perform one. So we set our start frame instant block to the current tick variable that we have. The current tick is an integer that goes from 0 to 59 because it stores all the frames in a given second. Typically 1 second will have 60 frames, 0 to 59 is 60 elements, and so that's the thought process behind that. It is updated in tick every frame, and so once it reaches 59, it rolls over and goes back to 0. We're setting our start frame instant block equal to the current tick, basically the current frame, but within the range of 0 to 59. And that is the frame that we started our initial block attempt. Now, if the num frames until instant block attempt is greater than 0, that means we are still in the spam protection and we can't perform an instant block, in which case we want to invalidate the start frame that the instant block was performed. And we do that by setting it to -1. And this is the log you saw earlier in this episode or in the previous episode if you watched that one. Regardless of what happens here, we update the num frames until instant block attempt equal to this constant value that I have, which is a constant integer frames between instant block attempts, and this is how many frames I have between spam protection. I believe the value I gave it was 8, but we can double check this really quickly. So the window is 8, the frames between instant block attempts is actually 10, so there you go. Here are all the variables from the previous episode, if you need a refresher on them. Again, they are explained in depth in that episode. Alright, so all this logic occurred when we pressed the manual block button. Now we want all this logic to occur whenever we press the back button, whether it be standing back, jumping back, or crouching back. And so what I've done is I've copied the logic that was in here, and I've put it into our new function that we created today. So let's go and create our new function. So void a fighter template character, : start tracking instant block data. And then in here you'll see it's the exact same logic that I just went over. So if you already followed the last episode, you can copy your logic and paste it right in here. But if not, you can add this logic now. And essentially, whenever we press any of the back inputs, we'll go through this logic. But we need to know where to call it. So I actually do all my back input data from my move right and my move right controller functions. If you haven't been following the series, I have 2 different functions for move right. I have one on keyboard and one on controller. The main differences for move right and move right controllers are just the dead zones and joysticks, but really we don't need 2 separate functions. I've done it for ease. If you don't have them, don't worry about making them. But you should have at least one move right function. Since I have both, I am going to implement it in both. It is actually quite simple. But don't go out of your way to make another one if you only have one move right function. You don't have a separate one for controller. It's not necessary for this episode. And so you can see move right for me is just for keyboards. And now I determine a lot of things. I determine if we're not crouching, and if we're not crouching, we go into separate logic than if we are crouching. And because there's so much logic here, it can get confusing really easily, but I'm going to make it very simple for you. All we really have to do to make this work is determine when it is that we can perform an instant block in the move right function. And that is when we are pressing a backward input. Luckily, in my system already, I have all this set up, depending on the direction we're facing, what buttons we were already pressing, things like that. You can see I call these perform input logic functions. The perform input logic is going to add that input to the buffer, but we don't care about the buffer so much for today. It's just we've already calculated where we press backward inputs. So if the perform input logic is using a type of backward, we're on the right track, but we don't want to do it on release. Instant block happens on press, not on release of the block input. So we need to be calling backward for the type and press for the status. You can see that none of these meet those requirements. This is backward but release, and this is forward and release. In the logic below that, we have forward and press, but then we have backward and press. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to perform an instant block if we've met the other conditions related to instant block. But this is how we can start checking to see if we performed an instant block. So I'm going to call my start tracking instant block data function now. And really what I recommend you do is just press Control F to bring up your search, copy this line, paste it in here, and press the arrow to go through and find all of them. But I'm not going to do that because I think it might make it more confusing when watching it. So what I'm going to do is just scroll down, and every time I find the appropriate function call, we can go ahead and put these values in. And so you see that we have a perform input logic here that is E input type backward, E input status press. I want to call my start tracking instant block data here. Now, if we scroll down, we go into another else statement. This else statement is related to the if statement above that was checking to see if we were crouching or not. So we've done the two standing block inputs, depending on the direction we're facing. And now we are in the else statement, meaning that we are crouching. But we can still perform an instant block while crouching. So we still have all these perform input logic functions right here, and we're going to use them the same way. So you see here we call perform input logic, and we have E input type backward, E input status press. This is the one we want to call start tracking instant block data on. Then we scroll down, go to the else, and then in here, finally, we check to see what direction we're facing, and we call perform input logic, E input type backward, and E input status press. We call our start tracking instant block data after that. It looks complicated, but let's make it a lot simpler. In your move right function, if you've been following the series, you have two directions that you can press, left or right, and they both call the move right function. Now, backward and forward are different from left and right. Backward and forward take into account the direction you're facing. So we have to check for the direction that we're pressing and then the direction that we're facing. We will call perform input logic functions for both cases, but passing in different variables, either forward or backward. So for each direction, there are 4 perform input logic calls, as you can see here. One of them will always have a backward and a press, which means one of them will always call start tracking instant block data. There's 2 directions. So for the not crouching and not crouch blocking state, basically the standing state, we're going to have 2 start tracking instant block datas. And so in the else statement that says yes, we are either crouching or crouch blocking, we have the same behavior where we check for pressing left or right on the keyboard, and then we check the direction we're facing. This means that we have 4 inputs total for the crouching. 1 from left and 1 from right are going to call the start tracking instant block data. So in move right, there should be 4 function calls to our new function, start tracking instant block data. and it is always going to be when you are pressing back. Now, if you are following the series directly and you have a move right controller like I do, no problem. It is the exact same rules for this part of it. This doesn't change. So in our move right controller function, we go to where we're checking and make sure we're not crouching. If we're not crouching, we look at the input types that we're putting in, and we need to make sure we are putting in a backward and a press. When we find it, we can add start tracking instant block data. Then we look at the other direction that we pressed, and we look for our perform input logic, backward and press, and we call our function. Then we go down to the else input related to the crouching. So this means that we are crouching, and we look at the direction that is being pressed on the joystick or on the gamepad, and we see that if we're going this direction, we have backward and press. So we want to call start tracking instant block data. Else, if we're pressing this direction and facing this direction, we want to call start tracking instant block data here. Long story short, always look for the line we have right here in our Control F. You can find them. You'll see we have 8 of them. Let's start at the top. This is the first one. You can see on the left where we are on the page, and you can see it is the highest one. All these red boxes are where the other ones are. So we're on the first one. We go to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 places where we call the backward input on a press, and at all 8 of those places we want to call start tracking instant block data. Now, once all that is done, we need to go to our tick function. So scroll down to the tick function. At this point, your instant block will be working essentially the same as it was in the previous episode, but now with your back inputs. The only real difference, and the thing that we need to add today, is making sure that just because the damage was received during that frame window to perform the instant block doesn't mean that you actually perform the instant block. Because remember, the current tick rolls over 0 to 59. And so if you were to wait a whole second, still in your block or still pressing your back button, and you got attacked, you actually could perform an instant block when you really shouldn't be able to. So we need to make sure we fix that issue. So in our tick, I scrolled down to where we updated this in the last episode, which is we were reducing the num frames until instant block attempt every frame, assuming that it was greater than 0, because this means that there was an instant block attempt, or there was a back button or a manual block button that was pressed. And at this point, we want to decrement from this value until it reaches 0, because otherwise they will be spam protected and locked out of pressing those inputs and being able to perform instant block, which obviously is not what we want. We only want to lock them out for a few frames. In my case, it was 10 frames. So once those 10 frames are up, they can of course make another attempt. I went right below that logic, and I've added this logic today. And so the new logic we're adding is to determine if the window for performing the instant block has passed, and validate the opportunity for an instant block if so. The logic here is actually quite simple, at least conceptually. So what we need to do is make sure that the player is even in a state to perform an instant block, or was. If they press an input, the start frame instant block is set to the current tick, right? We saw that earlier. And so if it's -1, it is invalidated. If the start frame instant block is greater than -1, that is the only time we actually want to do this logic. So if it's greater than -1, we go into here. And now I want to create a variable called maximum frame for instant block. You'll notice we've done this before in our take damage function. If I scroll up to take damage, there's a lot going on in take damage, but we've already done this before. This variable I'm making is really just a variable that keeps track of the final frame within the instant block window. Remember that instant block is a mechanic that once you press the back input, you have a given number of frames to receive a hit. And if you receive a hit within the given number of frames, you have instant blocked, which invalidates all damage and all that goodness. In our case, my frame window is 8 frames. In Guilty Gear, I believe it's only 2 or 3 frames, and so it's a lot more strict. But I made it a little bit higher for ease of use for myself. And so we just take our start frame instant block and add our frame window instant block to that. And that will get us our maximum frame. If we press the back button on frame 1 and we have 8 frames to perform an instant block, as long as the attack is blocked at frame 9 or lower, we are within that frame window. That is what maximum frame for instant block is for, and really that's what it's for in tick as well. So scrolling back down to tick, making this variable, it's the same as we saw in the previous episode. Current tick rolls over. You can actually see that right here. This is my current tick logic. We add to current tick every single frame. If it is greater than 59, meaning it is 60 or higher, we're going to reset it to 0. So it stores 60 values, 0 to 59. So if the maximum frame for instant block is greater than 59, it's at least 60. In which case, we want to take 60 away from it so that it fits within this range. So max frame for instant block minus equals 60. That just helps us account for the rollover. That way, current tick and maximum frame for instant block are working on the same level, because we need to compare them. We need to see if the current tick falls within that range. If it does roll over, then it starts to get a little bit more complicated, which is why we need our friend paint again. I don't need to do so many examples in this one, but I'm still going to give an example or two. So now we have, let's start with some logic here. Let's say we blocked on frame 55. And let's say the current tick, that's when we receive damage or receive the hit, is 58. Then lastly, our window is 8 frames. Now, to get the maximum frame for instant block, we need to take our starting block frame plus the window, and we get 55 plus 8. And what will that get us? That will get us 63. That is greater than 59. We want to subtract 60 from it. So 63 minus 60, and we get 3. Alright, so this is the maximum frame we can block on. We started on frame 55, and we can still perform the instant block if we receive that hit by frame 3. Now we just need to check and see if we fall within this range. If we do, we want to invalidate our starting block. So if the current tick is less than the start frame instant block at this point, current tick is 58. 58 is not less than 55. So this fails, and we don't go into this if statement. If we don't go into this if statement, that means we don't invalidate the instant block. They are within the window. And since they are within the window, we don't have to do anything else here. The problem comes in if this current tick is a value outside of this window that we have. So let's go ahead and change current tick, and I'll delete this as well. Now let's say current tick was frame 7. Alright, this is still the same over here by the window, but we need to check if current tick is less than start frame instant block. So we have 7 is less than 55. And that succeeds. That means we are less than this, and so we may be out of the bounds of the window to perform the instant block. But we're not positive just yet, because due to the rollover, this isn't enough information. And current tick also has to be greater than the maximum frame for instant block. Is 7 greater than 3? Yes. This means we're outside the window for the instant block, and we should invalidate the instant block. We can no longer perform it, so we will set start frame instant block to -1. Now let's do one final example, and this example is going to be one where the current tick is rolled over, but it fits within the range. So we'll use 2 as an example. The current tick is 2. Going through it one more time, we have current tick is less than start frame instant block. So 2 is less than 55. This is true, so we may have to invalidate our instant block attempt. Then we have to check and see if 2 is greater than maximum frame for instant block. 2 is greater than 3. That is false. We are within the range that we have, and thus we don't want to invalidate our instant block, so we will not set start frame instant block to -1. And there you go. So this is why we invalidate when rolling over. Understand that rolling over from 59 back to 0 is not the only time we can be out of the frame window. So if we start at frame 0 and we have 8 frames, we go to frame 8. If the attack landed on frame 12, well, 12 is obviously greater than 8. That is not within the window. We don't have to do any advanced logic here. So outside of this if statement, we have another if statement, and we just check if the current tick is greater than the maximum frame for instant block. So if cur tick is greater than max frames for instant block, set start frame instant block to -1. Now technically I'm actually doing this logic twice when it rolls over, which doesn't hurt anything. It's fine to do that, but we should put this inside of an else statement. That way, if it rolls over, it can invalidate it here and then doesn't do anything else. But if it doesn't roll over, it can invalidate it here. That way we're not calling it twice, and it's just a little bit faster, so we don't have to go through all that extra logic when we don't really need to. And there you go. That makes it so we can invalidate it, so we only have that window to perform that instant block. We can't wait a full second and then fall within that window again and then still perform it. So that bug from the previous episode is fixed. And there you go, guys. That's what I've got for you today. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed and this helped you make instant block in your series, then please subscribe. If you'd like to suggest any ideas from games that you've seen, like this one, or like Scorpion's Grapple or Teleport, I get that one a lot, then feel free to join the Patreon and YouTube membership, and I will gladly take your ideas and start making videos on them as soon as I can. Thank you for everyone who has joined and supported the series already. I really appreciate it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to help you, and it is completely free. But anyway, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.